She just bankrupted a cartel boss with a single keystroke, while a human trafficker thought he was cornering a terrified girl in an abandoned shipyard. Anna was busy draining $72 million from his offshore accounts. Dante Rossi, the city's most feared mafia king, stood in the shadows ready to execute the rival. She didn't use bullets to destroy an empire. She used numbers. Meet the most dangerous woman in the underworld. Let us open this psychiatric case file together, you and I. We begin with a classic display of the megalomaniacal narcissist asserting dominance. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt echoed through the penthouse, an auditory trigger signaling the trap. Anna Kensington entered this space under the profound delusion that she held the upper B hand. She was entirely incorrect. Dante Rossi exhibited no rage. He drew no weapon. A true sociopath rarely needs to. He simply slid the brass key into his tailored suit, unbuttoned his cuffs, and offered a calculated smile designed to project absolute ruin. "You wanted to play blé," he told her, his tone devoid of normal human empathy. In his domain, the loser becomes property. Outside, the Manhattan rain battered the glass, isolating her entirely. To understand the etiology of her trauma, we must rewind. Picture Anna in her sterile glass-walled office, the pale glow of monitors reflecting her analytical mind. As a forensic accountant, her brain was wired to detect anomalies hunting financial ghosts. Yet, within the corporate arteries of Dante Rossi, she unearthed an apex predator, $72 million. That was the precise figure that methodically drained from his shipping logistics into offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands.
Psychological shock did not stem from the sheer volume of the missing capital. Was the digital fingerprint left a transaction ledger?
Her physiological response was immediate, a severe spike in cortisol. The routing codes implicated her older brother Arthur. Here we observe a classic profile of an addict, a middle-aged manager consumed by his own gambling compulsions. In an act of spectacular cognitive dissonance, he attempted to steal from the easternmost most lethal crime syndicate to satisfy a secondary cartel. Anna understood the stakes instantly. Exposure meant complete erasure. This is where her clinical detachment failed, overridden by a desperate familial attachment. Bypassing law enforcement, whom she correctly assumed were compromised, she executed a highly irrational rescue protocol. She isolated the encrypted evidence of his theft, transferred it to a physical drive, and wiped out the corporate mainframe. She possessed the singular copy, operating under the fatal assumption that it gave her bargaining power. Her strategy was fundamentally flawed. Confront a cartel leader, propose a discreet reimbursement using personal loans, and purchase her siblings' survival. At 11 at night, the behavioral trap was set. A burner phone notification delivered the parameters. The penthouse, midnight. Come alone or do not come at all. The environment itself was designed to intimidate a towering structure of steel and glass in Tribeca. She submitted to a physical search by a security private acting effective blunting. That vertical ascent to the 68th floor induced acute anticipatory dread. The environment was a physical manifestation of his narcissistic pathology. Stepping from the elevator, Anna entered a cavernous space dominated by shadow, burning amber light, and brutalist art. Dante stood by the bar, pouring scotch, presenting the visual profile of an aristocratic monarch rather than a street-level criminal. This aesthetic refinement is a common camouflage for high-functioning psychopaths. He possessed its sharp features and eyes completely devoid of warmth. When he spoke her name, The resonant frequency of his voice caused an immediate autonomic nervous system reaction in her. He remarked that he had expected a cheap blackmailer, not a woman whose tachycardia was virtually audible across the marble floor. She attempted to regulate her vocal tremors, insisting she was not there to blackmail him, but to initiate a transaction. She gripped her bag, using the physical shape of hard drive as a grounding mechanism against her rising panic. Dante turned, using his physical to overwhelm her spatial boundaries. His gaze performed a systematic visual dissection, moving from her rain-soaked coat to her trembling extremities. He repeated the word transaction, depositing his glass against the marble with a sharp punctuating sound. The speed at which he closed the distance was designed to trigger her fight response. The scent of bergamot and tobacco acted as a sensory anchor, binding her in a state of paralysis. Let us examine the psychological demolition he initiates here. He breached her intimate zone, whispering near her ear, asking if she truly believed her discovery was accidental. This revelation induced momentary cardiac pause. He smoothly dismantled her reality, confirming her brother was marked for death the instant the theft occurred. But the narcissistic mind requires entertainment. He explained how he had analyzed her profile, noting her brilliance and severe familial loyalty. He had intentionally unsealed the mainframe, leaving a digital trail simply to test her behavioral limits. The realization that she was the primary target, not collateral damage, flooded her system with sheer panic just as the exit routes sealed completely. We returned to that heavy metallic click, the sound of total environmental control. Dante extracted the key. His expression displays the possessive fixation typical of extreme, dark, triad personalities. He declared the commencement of his game, establishing the core rule: the defeated become his property. The silence that followed was designed for sensory deprivation, forcing her mind to turn inward. You and I can see her cognitive processing failing as she calculates escape routes. The elevator requires biometric clearance. The stairwell is impenetrable. The reinforced glass is nothing but a 68-story drop. She realizes she is completely isolated in a secure enclosure, subjected entirely to the whims of a behavioral predator. She demanded her release, yet the micro-tremors in her vocal cords undermined her projection of authority. Dante responded by loosening his tie, his movements deliberately languid to contrast with her hyperarousal. He openly invited her to contact law enforcement, specifically offering the desk phone and naming a corrupt detective. This is a vital manipulation and tactic demonstrating that systemic rescue is impossible, thereby by accelerating the victim's sense of helplessness. Pressed against the thermal cold of the glass, she finally asked the fundamental question of the captive. She asked what he desired. Stopping just outside her striking range, he stated his intention to completely dissect her psychological composition. He exposed a fraction of a complex collarbone tattoo, a subtle visual reminder of his underlying brutality. He calmly laid out the judicial framework of his specific reality by breaching his network. Her life was legally forfeit in his mind. Yet, true to his megalomania, he offered a behavioral puzzle. Depositing a velvet box onto the table, he outlined the parameters. 3 hidden safes existed within the structure. One contained the biometric override sequence and a binding document absolving her brother. The reward was complete freedom. Her skepticism was an appropriate cognitive defense. When she inquired about the parameters of failure, he delivered the temporal constraint, so that she had precisely 48 hours to survive. The rules was specifically designed to weaponize her intelligence against her. He informed her that the cognitive skills she used to infiltrate his accounts would be required, but she would be subjected to continuous psychological interference. Every incorrect deduction would incur a penalty. When she questioned the nature of this punishment, his tone lowered, introducing the sexual threat inherent in the entity. He promised a systematic forfeiture of her physical and emotional boundaries. This is the mechanism used to shatter an ego, ensuring she comprehended her absolute lack of agency. If she failed within the time frame, her brother would be terminated, and her captivity would become permanent. The sheer dominance induced catatonia. Here we observe the genesis of Stockholm Syndrome. The fear began to merge with an involuntary, highly confusing surge of neurochemical arousal. She realized how he intended to execute a psychological vivisection rather than physical mutilation. When her residual ego flared, prompting her to declare she would not be his object, he proved her wrong instantly. He pinned her to the glass, applying precise manual pressure to her carotid artery, not to asphyxiate it, but to establish absolute physical supremacy. Her hands instinctively grasped his wrists, closing the physical circuit between victim and captor. In his pupil dilation, she recognized a profound, obsessive fixation. The understanding that she was designable, more stabilizing than death. He delivered his primary directive at point-blank range, establishing the conditioning protocol. Obedience to his voice. Complete yielding to his physical contact. He framed her resistance as a temporary amusement that would carry a heavy psychological toll. Releasing her suddenly, he induced a state of physical and mental disequilibrium. The countdown commenced. Hello, for the subsequent 6 hours, Anna exhibited manic, desperate behavior, dismantling the lower architecture of her prison. She systematically destroyed the library's organization and probed the structural integrity of the artwork. Meanwhile, Dante exhibited the relaxed posture of an apex predator, consuming espresso and silently studying his subject's rapid energy depletion. Stick with me, because this is where cognitive fatigue begins to erode her rational defenses. By 4 a.m, sleep deprivation significantly impaired her executive function. She discovered the initial stimulus under a humidor, a cipher penned in his exacting script, linking a bleeding ledger to an iron anchor. Her compromised logic immediately fixated on the subterranean wine cellar. Her descent down the spiral staircase was frantic, an expenditure of energy she could not afford. She spent 60 minutes engaged in a futile tactile examination of the vintage iron racks. Her failure was complete. Then his deliberate footsteps echoed on the stairs. The lesson here is simple. When we run on pure desperation, we blind ourselves to the traps laid right at our feet. The clinical file on Vittorio, or in this specific psychological profile, a subject designated as Dante open here. He descends into the dim cellar, stepping into the space of his captive, Anna. From a clinical perspective, his approach is textbook predatory behavior. He informs her she missed the false bottom by a mere inch, deliberately inducing a spike of adrenaline. As he presses her against the cold masonry, this megalomaniacal narcissist asserts total physical dominance. By invading her somatic boundary, he begins the deliberate dismantling of her autonomic nervous system. She closes her eyes, a classic flight response when physical escape is possible, bracing for the inevitable psychological subjugation. He commands her to open her eyes, forcing visual compliance before initiating a kiss that functions less as affection and entirely as a brand of ownership. In my years interviewing maximum security predators, this tactile invasion is a recognized method to short-circuit a victim's rational brain. Her hands clutched his shirt, a treacherous physiological reaction and indicating the earliest stages of trauma bonding. Her body registers the sensory input of scotch and overwhelming power, fracturing her psychological resolve. When he finally retreats, he whispers that she has one strike down, two more, and the behavioral experiment concludes. He does not place her in a cell. He places her in his own bed, accelerating the disorientation. The calculated environment of the master bedroom is crucial to analyze.
It is an opulent enclosure equipped with silk sheets and the wardrobe perfectly tailored to her measurements.
This is a glaring testament to his obsessive surveillance, a hallmark of the megalomaniacal narcissist who demands absolute control over his environment. As dawn illuminates the Manhattan skyline in bruised hues, her hypervigilance prevents sleep. She paces her perimeter, plagued by the phantom sensation of his physical coercion. Consciously, she despises the criminal enterprise he commands and his arrogant manipulation of human autonomy. Yet, her clinical distress stems from her own neurochemical betrayal, the autonomic arousal she experienced under his hands. You and I are going to unpack this psychological shift together, as it is the very foundation of Stockholm Syndrome. Her shame originates from the dark thrill of his dominance. Precisely at 8 in the morning, the Zoom enters bearing an assortment of espresso and fruit. His damp hair and casual attire serve to strip away the unapproachable mob boss persona, presenting a dangerously human facade. This is classic intermittent reinforcement. He orders her to consume the food. When she exhibits defensive posturing, wrapping her arms around her torso in the corner of the room, he does not yell. Instead, he utilizes gentle but immovable force to physically relocate her to a chair, demonstrating that her agency is entirely illusory. Let us examine a classic case of power dynamics. Dante forced Anna into the chair, demanding she eat. He threatened to feed her himself, a deliberate invasion of her autonomy. Recognizing the danger, Anna took the food, her hands trembling from an acute adrenaline dump. Dante sat across from Frivla, sipping his espresso, maintaining unblinking eye contact to assert absolute dominance. The silence between them was suffocating.
Her voice fracturing, she asked why she was trapped, noting he could have simply killed her brother.
Dante lowered his cup and leaned in to dismantle her mental defenses. The lesson here is quite simple. True psychological control rarely starts with overt violence. It begins the very moment a predator dictates your smallest, most basic daily choices. Dante displayed the classic grandiosity of a megalomaniacal narcissist. He stated that human behavior was entirely predictable to him. People lied, begged, and perished. But Anna was an anomaly who stepped into his domain to sacrifice herself. Then he delivered the psychological killing blow, revealing her brother had to cover his own debts. Acute cognitive dissonance set in for Anna. Her reality fractured as she desperately asked what he meant. Dante grew clinically cold, stripped of all sadistic amusement. He systematically destroyed her delusions, explaining her brother had actually been caught 3 weeks later. The iteration we must remember a harsh truth about human nature. Sometimes the people we sacrifice absolutely everything to say are the exact ones who pushed us into the fire. Anna entered immediate denial, a standard defense mechanism against profound trauma. She frantically insisted she had seen the ledgers. Dante countered smoothly, lowering his voice to a hypnotic whisper to sever her from her own memories. He explained Arthur owed a cartel $2 million, and had 1 week to pay or forfeit his life. Panic choked Anna as she begged him to stop. Notice how the narcissist isolates the victim by becoming the sole arbiter of truth. Dante stood, using his towering physical size to intimidate her, and ruthlessly detailed the betrayal. Arthur had offered a sickening trade. He traded his brilliant sister for his own survival, promising to set a trap. The lesson is agonizing but vital. Blind loyalty often hides the snare laid right beneath your own feet. Dante detailed the trap. Arthur left a digital trail he knew her intellect could not ignore, delivering her to pay his debt. Anna exploded in a textbook fight response. She repeatedly struck his chest, screaming that it was a calculated lie to break her. Dante remained completely passive, allowing her to exhaust her frantic energy against him. This is exactly where the sinister seeds of trauma bonding take root. When her strikes faded into weeping, he restrained her wrists and pulled her into a horrifyingly protective embrace. He murmured that he did not need to lie to destroy her, positioning himself as her only remaining sanctuary. Life teaches us a chilling reality in moments like this. The most dangerous individuals do not just cause your deepest wounds. They carefully position themselves as your only available cure. Dante whispered that her brother sold her to the monster, yet he offered a brilliant psychological pivot. If she cracked his code, she could leave and exact vengeance. If she failed, she must accept that only her captor truly valued her. Anna sobbed against his chest as her cognitive map of reality shattered. The sibling she risked everything for was the architect of her imprisonment. Terrifyingly, the psychopath holding her captive was now her sole anchor against total mental collapse. The parameters of her confinement had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer about rescuing family, but surviving this narcissist and her own unraveling sanity. Remember this simple truth. When your world shatters, be incredibly careful who you lean on. Some people will hold you tightly just to ensure you never have the strength to stand back up again. The revelation of betrayal completely rewired the psychological climate of the room. Anna's frantic desperation dissolved, instantly replaced by a cold, calculated rage. Her brother had not merely made an error. He actively weaponized her intellect and empathy to preserve his own life. If the kingpin was the devil, her brother was the Judas who sold her out. For the next 4 hours, Anna systematically dissected the sprawling library. With 36 hours remaining, she compartmentalized her grief, refusing to let acute trauma paralyze her cognitive function. She was no longer playing for her brother, for her own, the cipher, and escape this gilded cage.
There is a profound lesson in this mental shift. True clarity only arrives when you stop mourning the person who betrayed you and start focusing entirely on saving yourself.
Her desire to hunt her brother down proved her moral compass was rapidly adapting to the trauma. Dante retreated to his office, leaving her to dismantle the library. The silence was absolute, save for rustling pages and a ticking clock. Anna finally began to psychologically profile her captor. Her prior failure was not a flaw in logic, but a failure to grasp his immense ego. Dante thought like a predator obsessed with poetic irony. Applying this clinical analysis, she found the clue inside a hollowed-out copy of Dante Alighieri's Inferno. It was an arrogant hiding spot she had bypassed, assuming it was too cliché for a genius. The lesson here is crucial for survival. To outsmart a manipulator, you cannot rely on rational logic. You must force yourself to view the game board directly through the monster's own eyes. Let us examine the clinical breadcrumbs Dante left behind. You and I have likely made the mistake of assuming predators lacked sophistication. The note written on heavy cardstock read, "Truth is often veiled by the masters, painted in blood and shadow, hiding in plain sight behind a woman's sorrow. Look to the penitent." Anna has processed this through the lens of pure survival. Her hyper-vigilant mind immediately linked blood and shadow to chiaroscuro, the violent contrast of light and dark used by Renaissance painters. Dante's gallery was a cold projection of brutalist modernism. One calculated exception in the grand foyer. Operating on sheer adrenaline, Anna sprinted from the library, her bare feet completely silent against the freezing Italian marble. She halted before a massive, heavily gilded frame holding the penitent mage. It depicted a weeping woman trapped in divine light, consuming darkness, perfectly mirroring Anna's captivity. In my field, we learn a simple lesson. Predators hide their darkest secrets exactly where they want you to look. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A textbook acute stress. Response: desperation exhaled. She ran her trembling fingers over the ornate wooden border and pressed the canvas backing, hunting for any structural anomaly. Finding nothing, profound frustration choked her. Stepping back, she analyzed the heavy brass nameplate bolted to the bottom. Marisi Daka, Joe 1597. She gripped the cold metal. The brass plate shifted. With a mechanical hiss, the frame's bottom swung outward on a hidden hinge, exposing a modern biometric keypad. A red prompt demanded a 4-digit code. Before she could process this, the true manipulation began. A brilliant deduction. A calm voice echoed from the dark hallway. Anna flinched, spinning, to find Dante leaning against the archway. This is the ultimate power play of a megalomaniacal narcissist. His sleeves were rolled up, displaying heavily tattooed forearms. He stood there, holding 2 crystal glasses of bourbon. Offering a drink is a calculated tactic, blending lethal threat with false intimacy. The amber liquid caught the dim light, cementing his absolute control. Let us open the file on Subject A, Anna. Observe her initial resistance. "I found it," she stated, her voice projecting a false equilibrium over the flood of cortisol and adrenaline. "Now give me the pin." The apex predator of our study, Dante, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, approached her. He offered a glass, a calculated test of compliance. "I told you, this is a game of intellect and forfeit," he countered. He demanded a wager for the hint, 3 failed attempts, and the safe locks permanently. "You belong to me," he declared, establishing the absolute psychological dominance typical of his pathology. If she accepts the hint, she owes him an unfiltered truth. You and I must recognize the brilliant cruelty here. True control does not demand a life. It demands a secret. He wanted something she had never told a living soul. Anna focused on the keypad. Statistically, 10,000 possible combinations presented an improbable hurdle for her analytical brain. She yielded, accepting the hint. Dante savored his bourbon, the physical manifestation of his utter control. The code is the year the Rossi family shed its first drop of blood on American soil, he informed her. Anna's cognitive processing engaged fully. Forensic accounting is merely the archaeology of human greed. She had previously dissected the Rossi Holdings corporate charter, mapping their evolution from New York olive oil importers through Endless Shell Corporation. In clinical textbooks, we see her employing intellectualization as a defense mechanisms against extreme terror. "Your grandfather, Giovanni Rossi," she muttered, attempting to ground her escalating panic in historical facts. "He arrived in 1914, but the business incorporated in 1920. Dante corrected her with the chilling softness of a predator. Incorporation is a matter of law. I said blood. The psychological trigger worked perfectly. Anna froze, her memory retrieving the Castella Maris conflict, a brutal era of syndicate warfare. The Rossi faction acted as the silent financiers. She recalled a heavily redacted police report detailing Giovanni's initial consolidation of power through murder in the winter of 1928. A simple truth about human nature becomes evident here. Our deepest traumas are often unlocked by the darkest histories we study. Let us examine this moment of false relief. With trembling fingers, she entered 1928, the mechanism disengaged, emitting a green light. Anna exhaled, a classic parasympathetic nervous system response to perceived safety. She reached inside, anticipating the elevator override and the contract absolving her brother Arthur. Instead, her tactile senses encountered a Veltspot and folded parchment. She tore it open to find a new psychological torment. Clue 3D. The key to your freedom will be worn in the light, surrounded by wolves. What is this? She demanded. You said the safe held the code. Notice his masterful gaslighting. I signed to one of the safes held it. Dante corrected it with absolute serenity. There are 3. The maze had just begun.
You chose correctly, but you have not won, he stated. To induce claustrophobia. You owe me a truth. Anna met the gaze of her captor. Here.
We observe the foundational cracking of her psyche. She confessed that her theft was not born of sibling love for Arthur, but of profound guilt. She had introduced him to the underground gambling ring. She was financing her own absolution. For a megalomaniac narcissist like Dante, this admission of moral decay is deeply intoxicating. A flicker of genuine surprise gave way to dark, possessive approval.
Guilt is a useless emotion, he murmured, his thumb tracing her jawline in an act of non-consensual intimacy. It makes you weak.
But your ruthlessness is exquisite. Retrieved the box from the vault, presenting it as a reward for her psychological submission. In rested a diamond and sapphire necklace, a cold, heavy artifact of immense wealth. Put it on, Dante commanded. This was not a gift, it was a collar. We are leaving the penthouse to see the wolves. Shortly after, the atmosphere inside the armored vehicle was suffocatingly tense. Anna sat rigidly against the leather interior. The jewels rested like a chain against her clavicle. Dante had supplied a midnight blue silk gown, tailored with terrifying precision, leaving her entirely exposed, yet completely enclosed by his sign. You and I must note how the physical environment mirrors her internal state, luxurious, heavily armored, and entirely inescapable. Beside her, Dante embodied the calm, lethality an apex predator in a tailored tuxedo, projecting an aura designed to enforce absolute obedience. Their destination was an elite Manhattan hotel, hosting a high society masquerade, a profoundly fitting clinical environment where sociopaths mask themselves as philanthropists.
You are giving me a public stage,
Anna observed, seeking a theoretical escape vector as city lights blurred past the tinted glass. What prevents me from screaming for law enforcement the moment we arrive? Dante merely adjusted his platinum cuffs, undisturbed by her empty threat. Because you are an intelligent woman, he replied. He understood what she was only beginning to realize. Escape is an illusion when the captor owns the entire board.
You know the police in that rooms belong to me, Dante continued, methodically dismantling her hope. Furthermore, the moment you leave my side, Victor Sterling will acquire you.
The introduction of an external threat is a classic mechanism to accelerate Stockholm Syndrome. Anna demanded to know who Sterling was. Dante explained, with clinical detachment, that Sterling was the actual creditor of Arthur's $2 million debt.
Syndicate leader specializing in extortion and human trafficking.
Arthur had bartered her autonomy to both men. Dante revealed that his abduction was the only reason she was not currently bound for a foreign black market. A physiological cold sweat manifested across Anna's skin as the absolute betrayal of her brother settled into her cognitive framework. Let us dissect this critical pivot in her perception. The psychological torture transformed into a bizarre possessive form of shelter. Dante had isolated her not merely to punish, but to secure an asset from a rival. "Why protect me?" Anna whispered, her vocal cords constrained by trauma and confusion. Dante invaded her personal space, his scent of bergamot creating a powerful olfactory anchor. "Because you infiltrated my vault, you challenged me," he stated. "That makes you mine to break, mine to punish, and mine to protect." The narcissist cannot tolerate the theft of what he deems his property. No one touches what belongs to his empire. As the vehicle stopped at the grand entrance, paparazzi flashes simulated a lightning storm, illuminating the threshold of her new reality. The security chief, a man presenting severe blunted affect, opened the door. Dante extended his hand. When Anna accepted it, she noted the calluses tactile evidence that this subject engaged in direct physical brutality rather than just commanding it. They entered a ballroom of staggering opulence, illuminated by crystal fixtures. Dante provided her with the delicate silver mask, effectively removing her individual identity and replacing it with the persona he demanded. He applied a stark black mask to his own face. "Smile," he murmured, his hand pressing against her exposed lumbar region to enforce physical compliance. "The wolves are watching." The fundamental lesson of this case is stark in the presence of predators. Prey must learn to mimic their behavior perfectly to survive. For an hour, she maintained the facade of a devoted companion. She ingested small amounts of champagne to manage her anxiety, analyzing the social dynamics de romance with the precision of a behavioral auditor. She mapped the hierarchy, observing how alpha males instinctively yielded physical spady to Dante, their micro-expressions betraying profound, conditioned fear. When a local politician intercepted Dante, he issued a strict boundary command. "Stay exactly here." Anna remained stationed near an ice sculpture, her prefrontal cortex obsessively decoding the third clue regarding a key worn in the light. A beautiful bird in a very dangerous cage. An unfamiliar voice purred into her auditory space. She turned to find a tall subject with silver hair, concealing his face behind a golden mask. We must carefully observe this new variable. His smile projected charm, but his ocular presentation lacked all human warmth, a classic sign of psychopathy. He maintained a relaxed yet coiled posture, preparing for a predatory strike. "I do not believe we have met," Anna stated, her survival instincts triggering an immediate withdrawal response. "Victor Sterling," the subject replied with a mock bow. He weaponized her brother's name instantly, claiming Arthur's descriptions failed to do her justice. He attempted to triangulate the dynamic, labeling Dante a brute incapable of appreciating her value. The acute stress response caused vasoconstriction, making Anna's blood run cold. This was the trafficker. She scanned the perimeter for her captor, the man she now bizarrely viewed as her protector. "I have nothing to say to you," she informed Sterling with an icy vocal tone. He laughed, immediately employing a manipulation tactic known as reality distortion. He suggested Dante had fabricated the trafficking threat merely to position himself as her savior. "I am a businessman," Sterling claimed, offering her an immediate exit through the kitchens and the forgiveness of her brother's debt. I want you and I to pause here and look at her cognitive resilience. Anna was an auditor. She profiled individuals through their finer pathology. She knew Sterling was currently hemorrhaging illicit capital due to federal seizures. He possessed zero intention of granting her safe passage. He intended to leverage her as a high-value hostage to extort Dante's deeply documented pathological possessiveness. You are lying, Anna concluded. Her neurological equilibrium stabilized as she relied on empirical data rather than emotion. Your shell corporation, V-Star Logistics, recently suffered a $70 million asset forfeiture. You intend to use me to force Dante to absorb your financial hemorrhaging. The psychopath's mask fractured immediately. Sterling's manufactured charm evaporated into raw, unfiltered malice. He breached her physical boundary, attempting to seize her arm. Before contact could be initiated, a massive hand locked onto Sterling's shoulder. Dante's voice resonated like a seismic event, a low-frequency rumble of absolute territorial dominance. If you touch her, I will sever your hand and beat you to death with it. The captor had returned to defend his most prized psychological subject. You and I are going to unpack the pathology of this moment together. Sterling rose, the color draining from his face beneath that golden mask. He muttered a quick apology before vanishing into the crowd, but Dante Cagre paid him no mind. The classic megalomaniac narcissist rarely focuses on the prey that runs. His absolute fixation was entirely on Anna. He registered her rapid breathing and that defiant tilt of her chin. Without a word, he seized her hand, dragging her to the center of the room as the orchestra began a sweeping waltz. He pulled her flush against his chest, gripping her waist with bruising possessiveness. I told you to stay put. He growled in her ear, effortlessly bending her to his terrifying rhythm. He approached me. Anna shot back, her heart hammering wildly against his solid chest. And I handled it, Dante corrected her immediately. You provoked a cartel boss. Yet, beneath the clinical reprimand, there was a dark, unmistakable edge of pride in his voice. You are fearless, Anna. It is going to get you killed, or it is going to make you a queen. She looked up at him, her mind snapping back to the psychological game they were playing. She observed his crisp tuxedo, the perfectly tailored silk lapels, and then the focal point of her hypervigilance revealed itself. Tucked subtly into his breast pocket was a heavy antique brass key. The lesson here is simple. Ambition often blinds us to the jaws of the trap. It was the key to the third and final safe. Seeing it worn so openly, Anna caught her breath. She had to secure that key, but doing so required a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She had to make the apex predator lower his defenses. We see this often in survival scenarios, Lizzie. The victim feigned submission. She softened her posture, melting against him, sliding her hand up to the nape of his neck and tangling her fingers in his dark hair. Dante reacted predictably. His breath caught, his grip tightening as his eyes blazed with unguarded hunger. You are right, whispered Zuf softly, her lips hovering near his. I am fearless. As Dante leaned down, captured by her surrender, her free hand slipped toward his pocket. The orchestra swelled, sending sweeping cello notes vibrating through the polished floorboards of the grand ballroom. Anna was in a state of acute autonomic arousal, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against Dante. To the hundreds of masked elites watching, they appeared as a king and his captivated queen. But beneath the elegant veneer of the waltz, a silent, high-stakes war of attrition was raging. Anna rested her left-hand hand gently on the nape of his neck, her fingertips tracing the harsh line of his haircut to anchor him in a false sense of security. Meanwhile, her right hand trembling with adrenaline, slid down from his shoulder, just a single inch lower. All the while, Dante maintained a grip on her waist that was entirely unforgiving. He moved with the predatory grip of a man who commanded the environment simply by occupying it. His dark eyes, visible through the stark black mask, locked onto hers with a volatile cocktail of possessive fury and desire. He was entirely focused on her face. Anna took a slow, deep breath, letting her pure eyelids flutter shut a fraction of a second. She was subconsciously feigning total surrender to sort of the music and his physical proximity. As she exhaled, her right hand brushed the silk lapel of his tuxedo as fingers grazed the heavy, cold brass of the antique key. This in a single fluid motion, honed by years of nerve playing with flash drives under the high-pressure scrutiny of corporate audit panels. She pinched the head of the key. She dragged the object silently upward, masking the theft by stepping close and pressing her body flush against his. This sudden, intimate friction caused Dante to inhale sharply, his arm tightening to pull her entirely into his frame. The key slipped free. Anna palmed the cold metal, letting it bite into her skin, and smoothly transferred her hand to rest against his lower chest. The waltz hit its crescendo, and Dante spun her out, catching her hand before pulling her back into a dramatic dip. Anna gasped, staring up into the face of a true psychopath. Notice his control here. He did not pull her up immediately. He held her suspended over the polished floor, forcing her to endure a terrifying physical vulnerability. A slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile curved his lips. He leaned down, his mouth hovering millimeters from her ear. "If you wanted a souvenir of our first dance," Dante whispered, his voice a dark velvet that sent a shiver straight down her spine, "you only had to ask, did you really think you could pick the pocket of a man who built his empire on noticing every stolen dime?" Anna felt her blood turn to ice. She froze entirely. He had known the exact moment her fingers touched the brass. Dante pulled her upright, seamlessly blending the movement into the end of the song as the ballroom erupted into polite applause. "Keep it," he murmured, adjusting his cuff with chilling nonchalance. "Consider it a reward for your remarkable audacity. Very few men have tried to steal from me while looking me in the eye. None of them survived. You, however, make theft look like an art form." Before Anna could process the clinical humiliation and the twisted thrill of his words, Leo materialized at their side. The security chief wore a stony mask, but his body language screamed of a severe threat response. "Boss," Leo muttered softly over the applause. "Sterling did not leave. His men are blocking the service elevators, and we have 3 unmarked vehicles idling by the loading dock. He is making a play." Dante shifted instantly. The seductive, mocking captor vanished. In his place stood the ruthless syndicate boss, a pure manifestation of violent, unyielding calculation.
"Stick with me, because this is where the behavioral shift happens." His jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the room with lethal calculation. "He thinks he can force a negotiation by cornering us in public,"
Dante said coldly. He miscalculated. He turned to Anna, his hand wrapping around her wrist in a vice grip. "We are leaving. You do exactly as I say. You do not run. You do not speak. If you let go of my hand, his men will snatch you before you hit the lobby." Anna felt the cold sting of panic creeping into her throat. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice tight with terror. "Through the wolves," Dante replied grimly. Instead of heading for the standard exits, Dan pulled his captive directly toward the kitchens. The chaos of the catering staff there froze as Dante strode through the stainless steel labyrinth like a dark angel of death. A voice shouted from the loading dock, and two of Sterling's stepped into men's kitchen, dieses Hammerchen, holding suppressed nappies mammons. Anna screamed, but Dante ruthlessly yanked her behind the massive steel bulk of a commercial freezer. The deafening crack of gunfire shattered the culinary porcelain, echoing off the metal counters. Leo was already returning fire with terrifying mechanical precision. Anna clamped her hands over her ears in a desperate trauma response. Dante stood over her, drawing his own weapon from a concealed shoulder holster. I have interviewed men like him before. In the face of death, he did not look scared. He merely looked profoundly annoyed by the inconvenience. Stay down, Dante ordered, his voice originating in the metallic space. He stepped out from cover, and two precise, deafening shots rang out, followed by two heavy thuds. Clear, Leo barked. Dante reached down, hauling his captive to her feet. Anna was shaking uncontrollably. Her polished corporate illusion was shattering, replaced by the visceral horror of the criminal underworld. This was not numbers on a ledger. This was blood on white tile. Look at me, Dante commanded, gripping her cheek to force her attention away from the body eyes. Breathe, Anna. You are with me. Nothing has less than you. He dragged her out the loading dock doors and shoved her into a waiting, armored vehicle. Let us examine the aftermath together. The tires squealed against the wet asphalt as they tore away, leaving the chaos behind. Anna sat trembling in the leather seat, clutching the brass key so tightly her knuckles were stark white. 30 hours left, Anna, Dante said, his voice returning to that chilling, calm bass line. You have the key now. You just have to find the lock. The return to the penthouse felt like stepping back into a pressurized isolation chamber. The physiological arousal from the shootout ebbed, leaving Anna exhausted and dangerously attached to her protector. We call this Stockholm Syndrome. It is a vital life lesson that trauma alters our perception of safety. We begin to love the monster who shields us from other monsters. The heavy mahogany doors sealed them inside the psychological cage. Dante walked straight to the bar and poured a measure of neat scotch. He downed it in a single swallow. The pristine white silk of his dress shirt was a stark, disturbing contrast to the brutal violence he had just executed. You let me take the key, Anna said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. She walked toward him, holding the heavy brass object up in the dim light. You knew I would go for it. Why? Dante turned, leaning against the marble. Because a cage is only effective if the bird believes it can eventually fly out. I needed to see you had the nerves to take what you wanted, even when you knew the risks. Pure, unadulterated, narcissistic manipulation. Let us open this case file together, you and I. Observe the subject, Anna, exhibiting classic hypervigilance. She scowled at the heavy brass Victorian key in her hand. Her analytical mind, desperate to assert control, noted it belonged to a physical lock, not a digital oil scanner. Dante, exhibiting textbook traits of a megalomaniacal narcissist, offered a soft, reinforcing compliment. Anna paced the Persian rug, grounding herself in facts. She reminded him she had audited his shell companies and knew this penthouse was entirely smart-wired. But the narcissist thrives on a metrical knowledge. He softly reminded her she had not searched the entire board. Her pacing stopped. The mind's need for certainty is a heavy burden, often blinding us to the traps laid right at our feet. Her eyes darted across the lower level. The library, the cellar, the grand foyer, she had already torn them apart, in a frantic state of survival mode. The only sanctuary left was the master bedroom, the gilded cage he had provided. She sprinted for the staircase, driven by the adrenaline of prey. Behind her, Dante followed with slow, deliberate footsteps. The sociopathic mind does not rush. It savors the subjugation of its target. Anna burst into the suite, ignoring the silk sheets. She threw open the wardrobe, pushing past designer clothes he had purchased in her exact size, a chilling marker of his coercive control. She dropped to her knees, frantically tapping the walls. We often the such darkest corners for monsters, forgetting they hide in plain sight. Backing out of the closet with her chest heaving, she muttered to herself, desperately seeking an anchor in reality. Dante stepped into the doorway, arms crossed. Notice how he positions himself as the calm observer while she unravels. He instructed her to stop looking at the architecture and look for the history. Anna's panicked gaze swept past the modern art and sleek glass tables. Then her eyes locked onto a massive, battered leather steamer trunk at the foot of the bed. Bound in heavy iron and brass, it wore the scars of a century of travel. Her cognitive bias had previously dismissed it as mere vintage decor. True deception is a psychological art form. The most dangerous secrets are never buried. They are right out in the open, disguised as something entirely mundane. She dropped to her knees before the trunk. In the center of its heavy iron latch sat a brass keyhole. Her hand trembled with physiological stress as she inserted the key. It slid in perfectly. With a heavy clunk, the internal tumblers shifted, and the lock disengaged. She threw back the heavy leather lid, expecting a simple resolution. But the narcissist rarely offers a quick exit. There was no velvet box or piece of paper with a code, not a chance. Instead, the trunk was overflowing with manila folders, glossy photographs, and architectural blueprints. Anna reached in and pulled out the top folder. Her own name was meticulously printed on the tab. Her breath hitched as she opened the file. We must realize that our darkest fears have been often manifest not as literal monsters, but as the chilling documentation of our own vulnerabilities. Inside were candid photographs of her leaving her apartment, sitting at her desk and drinking coffee 3 months ago. The file contained her college transcripts, bank statements, and psychological profiles crafted by high-end headhunters. It was a complete forensic dissection of her mind. Digging deeper, she found files on rival cartels and internal leaks. Her brain began to short-circuit, unable to process this meticulously curated physical manifestation of her existence. This is a classic method of psychological breaking, overwhelming the subject with proof of their absolute powerlessness. Dante's voice lost its mocking edge as he coldly stated that her brother, Arthur, was a mere liability. The hardest truth to accept is that we are all simply data points to a predator, and until they decide we serve a greater purpose. He stopped just behind her, an imposing physical presence designed to trigger submissive instincts. He admitted her brother stole $70 million, an amount he considered trivial. What truly captivated his sociopathic curiosity was the accountant who had masked those digital tracks so perfectly that his own security team was blinded for a month. Anna stood up slowly, clutching the file in a defensive posture. She accused him of investigating her. Dante reframed the narrative entirely, claiming he had studied her. His eyes burned with a calculated fixation. He had watched her surgical precision in dismantling corporate frauds and observed her protecting a worthless brother. True power is never loud. It is the quiet, methodical observation of another person's greatest weakness. He described seeing a mind sharper than any weapon, trapped in mediocrity, obedient to lesser men. By validating her unrecognized genius, the narcissist begins the seductive process of trauma bonding. Her voice cracked as she realized Plige were merely an interview. The Dante pulled a black remote from his pocket and pressed it. The reinforced doors of the private elevator hummed open. He tossed the remote aside, declaring the doors unlocked. There was never a code. Anna stared at the illuminated car. It represented freedom, Manhattan, and her quiet apartment. Then Dante stepped closer on his covers, casually mentioning a rival's move on his territory. The greatest psychological prison is built not with iron bars, but with the illusion of an open door that the captive simply chooses not to walk through. Let's pause and examine this pivotal moment together. The magnetic pull of his pathology was almost unbearable. He confessed to orchestrating the entire scenario to rip her from her ordinary existence. The satires of furious betrayal were welded in Anna's eyes as she accused him of placing her in a cartel's crossfire. She called him a monster.
Instead of denying it, Dante reframed his grandiosity, declaring himself the king of the city. He reached out, his rough hands cupping her face, wiping away a tear.
This intimate physical touch, amidst extreme emotional distress, accelerates Stockholm Syndrome. He told her a king needs a queen who can see the numbers behind the blood. A damaged mind will often forgive a monster, provided that the monster's thinker makes them completely and utterly indispensable. He praised her for stealing the key from its pocket while he held her. Then, employing the ultimate manipulative tactic, he stepped back and gestured to the elevator. He declared the 48 hours over. She had survived the wolves. He offered her the choice to return to her quiet life, assuring her that her brother was alive and debt-free. But then, the possessive shadow of the narcissist returned to his aristocratic features. He held out his hand, whispering that if she stayed, she would never be ordinary again. She would sit at the head of the table and help dismantle his rival piece by piece. True manipulation is not forcing someone to do your will. It is creating a vacuum of profound emotional validation that they willingly step into, abandoning everything they once were. He was offering her the board. Anna looked at the open elevator, where the neon lights promised safety, routine, and a life free of violence.
Then she looked at the leather trunk containing the clinical evidence of her own ruthless potential. Finally, her gaze settled on Dante, a monster, manipulator, but crucially,
the only individual who had ever validated her dark intellect. The silence in the penthouse was the sound of a psychological threshold being crossed. Anna took a deep breath. The manila folder felt like an anchor weighing her down. She never looked at the elevator again. She walked past Dante, her silk gown whispering against the marble, and dropped the dossier onto his oak desk. Sometimes, the desire to be truly seen is far more intoxicating than the basic human need to be safe. She turned to face him, her chin tilted up, eyes calculating. This is the exact moment the trauma bond solidifies into an active partnership. Her voice was steady, stripped of the fear that had dominated her nervous system for 2 days. She stated her terms clearly. She would not stay as a hostage. If he wanted her mind, he had to grant her the authority to use. He killed with bullets. She killed with numbers. She demanded full access to his servers and offshore routing protocols. Dante stood motionless. Then, a slow, deeply unsettling smile spread across his face. It was the look of a predator who had finally found his equal. When we surrender our morality to secure our empowerment, we do not defeat the monster. We simply agree to share its territory. Dante tossed a black key card onto the desk, granting her biometric clearance. He closed the distance until his chest brushed hers, his breath hot against her skin. Look, this calculated physical intimacy reinforces her elevated status within his hierarchy. He challenged her to show him the monster hiding behind the spreadsheets. Within 48 hours, The penthouse evolved from a gilded cage into a clinical war room. Anna shed her gown for his clothing, marking a psychological shedding of her former identity. Surrounded by glowing monitors, she became a predator in her own right, mapping Sterling's empire, a mapping sloppy mess of brute force lacking Dante's finesse. The human brain is terrifyingly adaptable. It can normalize extreme danger almost instantly if given a complex problem to solve. Sterling's liquidity was tied to a wealth manager named Richard Caldwell. You and I must understand the profound shift in dynamics occurring here. Anna explained that Sterling was hemorrhaging cash, pointing at the cascading codes on her monitor. Dante stood directly behind her, his hands resting heavily on her chair, a possessive anchoring gesture. She clinically diagnosed the rival's weakness. Sterling needed capital by the end of the week, or his men would turn on him. He relied entirely on Caldwell to funnel clean money. From the doorway,
Leo noted Caldwell was heavily guarded. Notice how seamlessly Anna has integrated into this violent environment. When an individual finally embraces their psychological shadows,
they do not merely survive the wolves. They begin to orchestrate the hunt. We begin our clinical observation with a classic manifestation of adaptive survival mutating into predatory behavior. Anna proposes a digital strike rather than physical violence to neutralize the rival threat without igniting a street war. Notice how clinically she isolates the encrypted handshake protocol to intercept the rival funds. But here is the pathological pivot. She refuses to merely reroute the operating budget. She insists on draining it entirely into an irrevocable Geneva trust. To execute this, she volunteers herself as the ultimate bait. Today, you and I are going to unpack this psychological descent together, observing exactly how a former hostage willingly steps into the crosshairs to appease a violent criminal organization. Let us examine the mechanics of her manipulation. She understands that the rival kingpin, Victor Sterling, is highly paranoid. If the money vanishes, he will simply vanish with it. He must believe he has won right until the cognitive dissonance of his total ruin sets in. When Dante questions the nature of the bait, Anna offers herself. We see a textbook escalation of Stockholm syndrome here. Victim now actively weaponizes her own perceived vulnerability. She argues that Victor views her merely as a desperate civilian looking escaped danger in control. By transmitting a fake distress signal offering financial ledgers for extraction, she ensures Victor will arrive in person, driven by his own narcissistic need to claim his rival's prize. The interaction that follows is a fascinating study in power dynamics. Dante forbids her from leaving his fortified environment, his voice dropping to a lethal warning as he physically restrains her against him. This is the possessive terror of the megalomaniac narcissist. He views her not as a partner, but as an extension of his own ego. Yet Anna does not shrink from the aggression. She mirrors it. She reminds him that he desired a queen, and queens do not cower when the final move is initiated. She articulates a rational necessity. She must access a hardline terminal outside his network to mask the digital trail. Dante stares down at her, his psychological dominance challenged by the very monster he has carefully cultivated. You might be wondering the same thing I did when reviewing this file. Why does a man who built an empire on absolute unyielding control suddenly seek to surrender it? Dante studies her face and realizes she is no longer the frightened accountant from 3 days prior. She has been forged in the furnace of his own violence. His response is a terrifying declaration of proportional retaliation, promising to burn an entire city to ashes if a single hair on her head is harmed. Anna seals this deadly psychiatric pact by pulling him into a desperate, branding kiss, assuring him he will be right behind her. Hours later, the midnight fog rolls thick over the East River, blanketing the skeletal, ruddy remains of the abandoned Brooklyn Navy Yard. Inside the decaying structure of Warehouse 4, a single harsh halogen light illuminates a makeshift office encased in reinforced glass. Anna sits perfectly still at a metal desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard of a ruggedized terminal. Clinically speaking, her biological markers would show a frantic, elevated heart rate. Yet her cognitive function remains terrifyingly sharp. The heavy, rusted iron doors of the facility shriek in protest as they are violently forced open. 4 black vehicles breach the perimeter, their bright headlights slicing through the damp gloom. A dozen heavily armed enforcers spill out onto the concrete, their heavy boots echoing through the cavernous space. The trap is now fully set. Let us look at the rival kingpin, Victor Sterling, as he steps from the center vehicle. He is draped in tailored cashmere, his silver hair catching the stark industrial light. His body language is with the unchecked arrogance of a man convinced of his own supreme intellect. He approaches the closure with a reptilian curving of his lips. He openly admits to Anna that he initially suspected a trap, but allowed his technical team to validate her distress signal. His fatal flaw is his inherent narcissistic bias. He genuinely believes he's not smart to outmaneuver Dante, and that Anna is simply a terrified girl fleeing a monster. Anna does not even break her visual focus from the screen as she addresses him. She maintains the deception with sociopathic composure, demanding safe passage in exchange for Dante's offshore routing numbers. Sterling purrs his agreement, instructing her to unlock the door and hand over the drive, promising she will be well cared for. In this precise moment, Anna executes the final bypass protocol on the Miami servers. The loading bar hits 90%. She finally breaks her gaze from the terminal and looks directly into his eyes, her voice projecting clearly through the intercom. This is the psychological crescendo. She calmly informs him that she never possessed Dante's financial ledgers. She has his. We see the immediate physiological collapse of Sterling's confidence as his smile falters into confusion. Anna clinically recites the account details, confirming the transfer meant for his cartel suppliers has just been processed. Sterling's encrypted phone vibrates violently in his pocket. As he reads the frantic message from his accountant, all blood drains from his face. $72 million, Anna whispers, striking the final key. The funds are irrevocable. She systematically outlines his new reality. He is bankrupt, and his international suppliers will soon realize he cannot pay them. The total destruction of his ego triggers immediate, primitive rage. He draws a heavy caliber weapon and screams for his men to shatter the glass and execute her. But before a single trigger can be pulled, the entire warehouse plunges into pitch black. Stick with me. This is where the behavioral data gets incredibly dark. What follows is not a reciprocal firefight, but mathematically precise execution. Suppressed sniper fire rains down from the rusted catwalks above. Dante's elite enforcers materialize from the absolute shadows, operating with a synchronized lethality that speaks to years of conditioned violence. In under 10 seconds, Sterling's entire protective detail is eliminated. Blinded by panic, Sterling spins wildly, firing his weapon into the void. A single retaliatory shot shatters his kneecap. He collapses to the concrete, shrieking in agony. From the impenetrable darkness behind the idling vehicles, the megalomaniac narcissist himself finally steps into the light. Dante's facial micro-expressions are entirely absent, replaced by the blank, unadulterated mask of a man intent on absolute murder. He approaches the bleeding rival boss, his leather shoes striking the floor with rhythmic, deliberate finality. Sterling clutches his ruined leg, whisper all previous arrogance and completely replaced by raw, frantic terror. He begs. He offers properties, routing numbers, desperate bargains. Dante simply stands over him, projecting the detached, clinical disgust of a man observing a crushed insect. He quietly reminds Sterling of the fatal error of threatening what belongs to him. With chilling calm, Dante states there are no negotiations for a dead man, firing a single bullet to permanently eliminate the rival empire. The echoing crack of the gunshot fades into the damp night. Anna steps out of the glass enclosure. Notice her complete lack of a normal startle response. She does not flinch at the bodies or the expanding pools of blood. Her desensitization to violence is now absolute. Dante closes the distance, his hands gripping her shoulders as he frantically assesses her for physical trauma. Finding none, he pulls her into a crushing, desperate embrace. Anna wraps her arms tightly around him, verbalizing the dark, intoxicating thrill of their shared victory. She claims they broke him. Dante immediately reinforces a new identity, praising his brilliant queen and pressing a fierce, branding kiss to her lips that cements their traumatic bond forever. Dante softly insists he merely cleaned up the resulting mess. An hour later, we observe them back in the sterile, high-control environment of the Tribeca penthouse. The meteorological storm has passed, leaving a crystal-clear view of the sprawling Manhattan skyline that Dante actively dominates. Anna stands by the towering windows, sipping expensive scotch, fully absorbing the scope of the criminal syndicate, Fabilba's rule. Dante approaches silently from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist and anchoring himself to her. They observe the glittering city together, functioning as two apex predators perfectly aligned in their pathology. In her pocket, Anna's fingers brush against the heavy brass key she previously stole from him. She allows herself a slow, secret smile. When they entered the penthouse that night, Dante had not locked the heavy mahogany doors to trap her inside. She had locked them herself, choosing to remain in the cage she had just caged. You and I have probably both witnessed people change under pressure, but this is the ultimate psychological metamorphosis. The clinical lesson here is simple. Survival requires adaptation, but we must be careful not to fall in love with the monsters we fight. Otherwise, the sharpest weapon is no longer a gun, but a corrupted mind. I leave you with this final evaluation. Did she make the rational choice staying with Dante, or should she have taken the elevator when she had the chance? This story is a dark, intense lesson about loyalty, manipulation, intelligence, and the dangerous price of trying to save someone who has already betrayed you. Anna Kensington begins as a brilliant forensic accountant who believes she is risking everything to protect her brother Arthur. She discovers a $72 million theft connected to him and walks into Dante Brassi's penthouse, thinking she can negotiate with a criminal king. But the deeper truth is devastating. Arthur has not simply made a mistake. He has used Anna's loyalty as currency to save himself. The first lesson is that love for family should not blind us to reality. Anna's loyalty is admirable, but it is also dangerous because Arthur knows exactly how to exploit it. He understands that Anna is responsible and intelligent and protective, so he creates a trap that only she would walk into. This teaches viewers that loyalty without boundaries can become self-destruction. Helping family is meaningful, but we must also recognize when someone is using guilt to control us. Another important lesson is about intelligence as power. Anna is not physically stronger than the men around her. She has no army, no weapons, and no criminal empire. Her weapon is her mind. She reads financial patterns, follows hidden structures, solves Dante-esque clues, and eventually destroys Victor Sterling's empire by draining his money. This is educational because it shows that power does not always come from fusas stultus. Knowledge, discipline, and critical thinking can be just as dangerous as any gun. Dante's role in the story is morally complicated. He manipulates Anna, traps her, and turns her life into a psychological game. Yet he also sees her brilliance when others only see her usefulness. The story's viewers view to think carefully about the difference between being recognized and being controlled. Dante values Ananas's mind, but his methods are dangerous and possessive. Real respect should not require captivity or fear. This is one of the strongest warnings in the story. Anna's transformation is powerful because she stops fighting only for Arthur and begins fighting for herself. At first, she wants to escape Dante's penthouse. Later, when the elevator opens and she is given the choice to leave, she realizes that the old life no longer fits her. Whether viewers agree with her choice or not, the lesson is clear. Freedom is not only about walking away, it is about deciding what kind of life you truly want and accepting the cost of that decision. The final lesson is about reclaiming power, betrayal. Arthur sells Anna out. Sterling tries to use her. Dante tests her, but Anna refuses to remain a pawn. By the end, she becomes a strategist, a decision maker, and a woman who understands her own value. For viewers, the message is meaningful. Never underestimate your mind. Do not let you sacrifice yourself for people who would not protect you in Montauk's betrayal. And when life reveals betrayal, use the truth not to collapse, but to become wiser, stronger, and impossible to manipulate again.